Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of FutureFramedTV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel, and I'm here today with Ujithra Ponniah. Ujithra is Wealth Inequalities and Elite Studies Fellow at the Southern Center of Inequality Study at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg in South Africa. And as the title of her position says, Ujithra is a specialist in studying wealth inequalities and elite studies. But today we're going to talk about the context of inequalities specifically in India, in Southern circumstances in general, but particularly in India, where there is a lot to talk about when we mention the topic of inequalities. Welcome, Ujithra.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you for having me. All right, so let me start the story of inequalities in India by sharing a few numbers. The Oxfam International brought out a report, and in 2017, we learned that the top 1% gained the 73% of the wealth that was made in the country, while the wealth for the bottom 67 million people grew only by 1%. Right? We have a state which taxes the wealthy very little, and as a consequence, the public investment in healthcare is one of the lowest. When it comes to food insecurity, India ranks 74th out of 113 countries in the Food Insecurity Index. We also have a lot of chronically malnourished children. Education is another sector in which investment from the state has been low consistently. So while the Indian economy opened up in the 1990s, and with the economy opening up, of course, opportunities for sections of the Indian population increased. But with that, inequality has also gone up. We have the top tiers accumulating large amounts of wealth, which is intergenerational in nature, while the bottom, the pie is limited, as we know, and the bottom seem to be not catching up. We also have a sizable middle class population, and the middle class is the one which is the most vocal when it comes to news channels and the public sphere, and represented when it comes to consumption and Bollywood cinema. So it catches the imagination of the world, and with our Prime Minister going and telling, speaking internationally about how India has become a global power. That's the image of India which travels. But the story of inequality is a very real one, and it affects the lives of everyday Indians on a daily basis.
And when we say everyday Indians, we're talking about 1 billion people. I mean, many people.
Billion and more, yes.
And more, yeah. And when we talk about the 1% in India, it's still a sizable number of people, right? Compared to 99% of 1 billion. How are these differences experienced in real life? I mean, how are the differences lived between this sizable group, but still a fraction of the total population, and these other 99%?
I think the wealthy definitely set the aspirational standards for what people would like their lives to look like. So when you look at our supermarkets and the malls and the movies, and it's their lives which get represented. But the lives of the toiling is not something which gets so much of a visual representation. The lives of the toiling on the everyday are your service class. These are the people who are going and working in the houses of the very, very elite people. And if you look at, visual representations of Mumbai, I think it captures it beautifully, because on one side you have these high-rise buildings, on the other side you have these sprawling slums from which emerges your service class. So for the urban spaces, the rich and the wealthy and the elites and their marriages, which gets showcased in newspapers, that's what catches the imagination. But the everyday lives are far from it. Right now, as we speak, the farmer protests are happening in Delhi, and they're one of the largest seen before. And 3 new farmer bills have been brought in, which gives the powers to the corporates to move more aggressively into agriculture, which anyways has seen a decline in public investment over time. So before the pandemic set in, we had another round of protests, and these round of protests were by women who were sitting on the streets, Muslim women, protesting against the Constitutional Amendment Act. So, there is a very active public sphere as well, where the protests are going on against what's happening. And this is a manifestation of inequality, the rising number of people in the streets. However, depending on the nature of the state, of course, as we know, that's how protests get organized. So we also have a state right now in the center, which is extremely authoritarian. So the farmer protests have also been received in that kind of a mode, right? Where you have border police and security moving in very aggressively, right? So the number of protests that we're seeing right now internationally, not just in India, is a manifestation of the inequalities. But in India specifically, you do have a government in power, which is an absolute majority at the time. The government does get a lot of approval from the middle class, who are the vocal sections, like I said. And the government is also constituted by the wealthy. So it is constituted by a core of upper caste businessmen, right? So in many ways, I would say, while the wealth and the lifestyles are something which would be aspirational, but the intergenerationally, it's impossible. And I'm saying intergenerationally, it's impossible, leave alone in one's own lifetime. Because if you look at mobility of people intergenerationally, occupationally, it has been stunted. Right, so there are no avenues for you to even think about. Perhaps you would have a lot of people walking around in supermarkets and malls, just walking and window shopping. But that's the aspirational again.
I'd like to pick you up on some of the key phrases, let's say, that you mentioned there in relation to specifically the protest you mentioned of Muslim women that occurred recently. And if you could remind us quickly what the protest was about, the constitutional amendment. But I'd like to connect it to what you mentioned, caste in India, right? Which we know is a specific Indian thing, but it's also probably visual in or perceivable in other regions with a different name, right? Or in other countries. Could you say something about the specificity of caste in India, what it means for inequality, and how it connects to these other dimensions that you mentioned?
Caste it's interesting that you say it's Indian. So I'll start with that first, because that is the common assumption around caste, because we think about it as an Indian thing, and many times it's also seen as this Hindu religious thing, right? It's connected to a religious sphere. And then because of these two variables, many a times caste system gets something which happens in India. And like you rightly said, we also see this happening in other parts of the world, perhaps through a different name. Now, when you look at caste in India, we realize, like I said, of course, with Hindu religiosity, it's mentioned in the scriptures, but Christianity, it's there in Sikhism, right? So it cuts across religion, and it doesn't just emerge from that religious sphere. That's one of the things to keep in mind. The other thing is that the caste system on the ground in India works through a category called the jati. Now, jati are these small endogamous units, they be constituted as subunits through which caste operationalizes. But through a popular imagination, people think about caste and they think about Brahmins and Vaishyas and Kshatriyas, which is called the Varna system, right? Having said this idea of the caste system being an Indian thing or Hindu religious thing is the way through which caste got when the British government came. And, we've been colonized for about 200 years. The British government, there were processes through which they enumerated castes. And it was easy for them to just do these four kind of layers because the jati system was too complicated for them. So, and once they did this four layers, then there was a very active process of self-identification where everybody wanted to be slotted in different, areas, especially when it got linked to affirmative action, right, which came in later. And so, to go back to this question of caste in India, no, caste is not just in India. And, Isabel Wilkinson has written this book where she's using caste as a lens to look at race in the US. So I think for us in the global south, and this is well documented in literature, a lot of people have been writing about it now, that to think about caste as an ascriptive hierarchy, I think then it makes it a conceptual tool for us to use it to try and understand the different kinds of hierarchies in a comparative framework. So caste system and understanding of it, and system is not very useful because then it makes you think about an enclosed system where everyone has their defined roles. But just to say, caste can be thought of as a conceptual tool, right, to think about inequalities in other places, which are based on ascription. And this is true for Western societies as well, right? They also have communities. It's just that perhaps the narrative of individualism has become very more pronounced in the West, and hence this kind of a literature is missing. And I think from the global south, that's when we look at the north, we can see so many similarities and commonalities, right?
What does it bring to this discussion about inequalities to have a conceptual tool, as you say, like caste? What is different about seeing inequalities through the lens of caste or tools in comparison to other horizontal inequalities?
Right. So the other way of thinking about inequalities is class, right? That's the other tool that we use. Now, if you think about caste and class, for example, class gives one the option to move up or down depending on one's resources. However, caste does not give that tool to a person. So a person could accrue a lot of wealth and continue to be a lower caste person and stigmatized. So there's something within the caste system which, when intersects with class, starts looking different, right? But caste per se has its own features. It has its own system of stratification, which is endemic to it. So intersectionality helps us to an extent because we can bring in caste. And as soon as we bring in caste, we realize that gender in the Indian context, we can't speak about gender unless we speak about caste. Because gendered identities reproduce themselves on the bedrock, on caste identity, sorry, reproduce themselves on the bedrock of gender. So that kind of an intersectionality is there, and we definitely have class as well. Now, intersectionality helps us think through these different layers of through which inequality gets stratified. However, I think it's that many a times there is a tendency to think of class as the umbrella term and caste as something which is a subset within it. And I think a lot of this also comes from rudimentary Marxian understandings where class becomes this overarching thing. However, it takes away from the specificity of inequality, right? Locally, inequalities manifest themselves in different way, and caste helps us understand because caste also gives that regional variation to inequality, which class perhaps doesn't. Yeah, intersectionality definitely a useful tool when one works with caste, but there is always this danger that one might use the intersectionality lens and end up doing just what on the left people call identity politics, right? Well, identity politics is essential, and I would not deny it. Without the existence of identity politics, people would just use umbrella categories and miss out on nuances. But there needs to be a healthy engagement between this literature on class and caste, and I would say using an intersectional lens to political economy gives one a really localized as well as a comparative framework to try and understand how inequalities manifest. And are also sustained and made durable over generations, right? Caste is not just 100, 200 years. It's been there for such a long time.
That's actually one of the important aspects. Caste can be inherited to some degree, right? And that makes it a lot more difficult to escape this structure or straitjacket, if you will. And I'd like to come back here to the specificity of the women, Muslim women protests that you had. What is the situation of women in general and probably this Muslim women minority? What are they protesting against?
Right. So these were protests which happened in Shaheen Bagh. This is an area in Delhi where Muslim women had come and they'd occupied the streets and they blocked important connecting highways. And with the current right-wing government in power, there has been systemic attacks on Muslims as well as Dalits. Even the national crime, NCRB, our official criminal record, would also document the uprise in crime against minorities. And particularly in Delhi, this started manifesting with the aggressive privatization of higher education, which we've had for some time. However, in 2016, with a very vocal attack from the government on public universities, there had been repeated police atrocities of police just barging in and attacking students, and anybody who was organizing was getting picked up, and Muslim students were getting targeted specifically. This was the backdrop around which also Constitutional Amendment Act was passed. Now, which is called the CAA. The Constitutional Amendment Act requires Indian citizens to provide documents to ascertain that they are Indians, right? And it requires land records, and from a particular year, there's a cutoff mark which has been given. And a lot of documents are not there because you have a lot of poor people. And why the sudden need to show that you are the citizen of this country when you've been doing this for such a long time? You've been living in this country for a long time, and now this need arises. And they also said that Hindus who had been persecuted in other countries would be given refuge here. So this idea of the Hindus who have been victim and not just nationally, how with dominant communities, there is a tendency to think about the victimhood narrative is very loud. And I think the victimhood narrative is required so that you can constantly paint an other. So the other here, very carefully, they had crafted it within this amendment to the Constitution. Our Constitution is a highly egalitarian piece of document. It's a very well-written one, and which speaks about principles of equality and justice and fraternity. And here you go and you...
And then what happened?
Yeah, and then this happens, right? Just liberty, equality, fraternity goes out of the window, and then you have this kind of an amendment which happens. So these women, a lot of old Muslim women, were sitting on the streets and they were vociferously critiquing the government. Yeah, and I'd gone to this protest site, and it was amazing because it's interesting that the minority see the need to shoulder the constitutional identity of being Indians and to have the Indian flag even louder than the Hindu would, because it's understood that if you're Hindu, by default, you're Indian. But if you're a Muslim, you need to prove that you're you are Indian. So there was the whole Indian flag, and there was the poetry sessions going on. There was tea being made. Women were on the stage. It was a sense of a community. Women were taking rounds to bring their children to come and they would leave them in school. Some of the children were sitting with them at the side. There was a corner that was made where books were being sold, children were being taught. It was a very lively space, and the protests did go on, but then the pandemic set in. And of course, you couldn't collectivize. So the pandemic was a great way for the protests to be broken. And that this is the last big protest that we had before the pandemic. And now we see the farmer protests happening.
Well, that's very, very sad that there's such a unexpected collateral from, another unexpected collateral from this pandemic. Do you think there is chance or hope for these protests to reach some of their demands, to be heard?
For sure. I think the point about living in a democracy, even if it seems to be crumbling day by day, is to have a citizenry which is critical. And with large sections of the middle class, you would see apathy, which is very loud. And apathy, psychologists will tell you, is a mental condition. When we are supposed to think about human beings as being interconnected, there is no sense of a collective. And this takes me back to the question of caste, because B.R. Ambedkar, who's the father of the Indian Constitution, he would tell you that in India, with the caste system, it would be impossible to have a sense of a collective because everybody is housed within their own small groups, these endogamous groups that marry within each other and only care for each other. So where would there be a spirit of this collective? That idea is an ideal world. So Ambedkar would say that you cannot think of forming a nation on the bedrock of something like caste because it's exclusionary.
Is that part of the intention, let's say, of caste?
Yes,
separate?
Absolutely. So the caste system, if we think about it as a structural reason for inequality in India, and I think it's important to emphasize structural here because many a times, cultural or ritual narratives of caste get louder in people's imagination or perhaps in written word. But to think about caste as a structure, as soon as we say, we immediately think about exclusion and discrimination and hierarchies and patriarchy and power and a certain ordering of the society based on this structure. And that's what caste does. So it has implications on the labor market, on the economy, on urban space. In Delhi, if you go, I can tell you easily in which neighborhood you could find which caste. And there is new research that is coming up from UPenn where they would tell you that the kinds of caste segregation in villages in down south in Karnataka are even more than what you would have seen in South American black-white segregation. So it's even more stark than that. But of course, race has got more, there has been more written word around it. There's more academic attention. There has been a movement which is much more sustained. When it comes to caste, last time it tried to get into the international sphere was 2011 during the Durban conference when, activists wanted to equate caste with race so that it would get international recognition. But the Indian government vociferously said, no, that's not going to happen. So caste then becomes only an India story, and which is like we started our discussion by saying it's not an India story. On the contrary, here is a conceptual tool. Let's look at each of our societies and say, why is there so many cleavages? Why is there so much segregation? Why is inequality so durable? A year after year, we talk about public policies and, changes. And sure, social policies are important, but social policies are also not made in vacuum. As I said, caste is structural. So social policies also end up manifesting those structural inequalities. For the longest time after independence, because caste was seen as a ritual or a cultural thing, it did not find its place when it came to, say, land reforms. And so the land reforms, anyways, in the country, the success is, I think, around 2.1%. But to think that the Dalits or the lower castes in this country have never had land, right? That requires a different kind of a conceptual understanding of inequality. And that kind of an understanding, now we do have a lot of literature in India. A lot of writing is going in this direction. Even economists have woken up to it and they're writing about it.
Does that give you hope for a systematic change?
No, I think systematic change. I think sociologists tend to focus on the micro. And when I do think about large scale change in the current political environment, I would say the hope is a little lower at the moment.
Okay, you're thinking about an ideal context, let's say. What do you think would be necessary to break up these structural inequalities?
Can I say revolution? This is all.
Sure.
Absolutely. No, I think if we're going to be working with existing government in power, which seems to be, like I said, an absolute majority, and privatizing right and left very aggressively, including the environment which is being impacted. I think the protests on the street are going to get louder, and so will the opposition from the state. We're yet to see how this goes. So I don't have an answer.
Before we round up, and we don't want to end on this very dramatic note, I'd like to ask you, Uji, why are you interested in this subject? Why do you think it's worthwhile researching and, I mean, dedicating all your professional and part of your personal life to, or maybe also all of your personal life?
I ended up wanting to study up after spending the little bit of my academic and research career focusing on lower down, because for the longest time, I think early 2000s, the nature of the Indian state was such that the Right to Food Security Act, there was the right vocabulary. The rights vocabulary was more pronounced around that time. And it looked like, there was the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which was more successful. So I did believe that public policy would definitely have a significant role to play in ameliorating the conditions of people's life. The reason I decided to move up is because I saw the nature of the Indian state change. And with that, I thought it was important to see where power was getting accumulated and why the structures of inequality looked the way they did. So I chose to study up because of that, and a specific focus on caste. And now with South Africa, I'm hoping to also bring in race, is because I've never been satisfied with this umbrella category of the class. I mean, class doesn't make sense. It doesn't answer the complexities of the societies that we live in. I think we need more tools. It doesn't speak to the everyday life. It doesn't speak to anything.
Fantastic. Fantastic answer. Congratulations. Let me ask you one last question. I mean, as we know now, you also work on South Africa, and you're engaging very much with the literature there. Do you think there are differences or there are similarities? I mean, which one prevails when you compare it to the Indian case?
I think it would be a bit too early for me to answer this. I think I'll take another decade before I
a point of fair enough. Do you have a point of connection where you want to set on in Africa?
Sure. I'm definitely, like I said, I was interested in race and looking at wealth inequalities using that framework. And I think the nature of the South African state seems more promising. So there might be possibilities of suggesting actually some policy moves here when it comes to wealth inequality.
That's great. That's a positive note, or a hopeful note at least. Uji, thank you so much for enlightening us about not only the Indian context general and with regards to inequalities, but also specifically about the caste and its sustainability and its conceptual usefulness as a tool when describing inequalities that go beyond specific individual categories of class or race or gender or any other, right? We don't want to use the umbrella term. It's the conceptual tool that unites these different categories and gives it a new meaning, not only in the Indian context, but in many contexts, if under different names, all over the world. Uji, we hope you continue studying this. We need to learn more about this very complex problem and how to resolve it with or without revolution. And we hope that you'll also get some great new insights from South Africa. In 10 years, we'll ask you again to answer this last question. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Alicia.
And thank you all for watching another episode of FutureFramedTV. I'm Elise Krozer, your host on the Inequalities channel. And I invite you to subscribe to our channel on YouTube or on Traces&Dreams website directly. If you like these topics, if you're interested in learning more about inequalities, please join us again next Saturday for another episode. Have a good afternoon. See you soon. Bye-bye.